I was talking to someone before the service and commenting on how time seems to have flown. In fact, many of us seem to have lost a year somewhere in the pandemic, but generally it's a sign of age, isn't it, when we say it doesn't seem so long since. And I was remembering back quite a few years to 1988 as I was looking at these readings and the themes from the Pastoral Principles. And in 1988 I attended a big conference in Canterbury before the Lambeth Conference of that year, which is the gathering of bishops from all over the Anglican Communion. And for me it was a turning point because I'd previously been involved in only one Anglican church. I wasn't brought up Anglican and was in an Anglican church and thought, like well, we all do, well everything is like this. And then was suddenly found myself with 3,000 other people from it seemed like every nation, about 50 or 60 nations, all doing things very differently. And it suddenly made me think, so this is the Anglican Communion. This is Anglicans from all over the world. And whether it was the Africans who seemed to like to move and dance to any song or hymn that was sung, or whether it was those who were much quieter because they were used to living out their faith privately in places where to be a Christian is very difficult. There was somehow that mix of different people and places that for me was an eye-opener and led to my involvement in a mission society and other things. Just getting that glimpse of a church that's always so much bigger than we imagine. It was a turning point. Interestingly, of course, most people may not remember that as 1988, and what also was there as part of the Lambeth 1988 was a resolution on sexuality, reaffirming a traditional view of marriage and the place of sex within it. Of course, since then, and probably before then, the Church of England seems particularly keen on debating issues of sexuality every year or every other year. And perhaps we're a little bit, here it goes again. And that's understandable, and there's another General Synod debate and coming up at the end of the year probably. And I think this year, or the last few years in preparing, people have understandably said what's different and at least what can we learn. And I think lots more energy is being put into simply helping people meet one another across the differences of opinion that are still very strongly held. And some of this Pastoral Principles course is really sort of asking the question, how can we live well together when we're very different and often can strongly disagree? Which of course is something that has much wider application than just the Church of England and its sexuality. There's something about disagreements, whether that's locally in church life, whether it's nationally, of course internationally at the minute, where it seems perhaps the most pertinent question that we should have been asking before it got to this point. How can we live well together when we're very different and can strongly disagree? We've got obviously many examples of how not to do it, and the Pastoral Principles is trying to say what positively can we do. And so we're aware of our failings, and Lent is a good time to be aware and reminded of our failings, but it's also a time for trying to build in better practices so we can say, look, I got it wrong, but let's at least try better and pray better that God will enable us to live lives well. And this Sunday, there are just two things to say. Obviously I'll say a bit more, but I'll try and keep myself briefer. But the first one is we've got to listen beyond ignorance, and the second one is that we are to pay attention to power. So those are two things that are highlighted to look at in this session. Listen beyond ignorance. I met someone last year, and I was getting to know them because they were interested in pastoral ministry and being alongside others and caring for them, trying to better listen to what they were saying and offer some wisdom. And he'd ask me all sorts of questions, and you feel like you're suddenly sharing a bit of wisdom. And then it suddenly struck me, of course, I hadn't asked the obvious question: what motivated him? What was his story? I realised that I'd seen him over a number of weeks, and I'd probably talked too much and then not listened. I'd heard him say, I want to learn more pastorally, but what I hadn't heard was his motivation. And it turned out that his background was growing up amongst the black gangs in London, and he was where there was everyone has their own turf and their own rules, and if you break the rules, then it's a rather dangerous time. So he had all sorts of stories of friends and relatives who'd been attacked or injured, and some difficult stories about the police and their roles and everything. And he wanted to care for people in those kind of situations. He wanted to make it better for them than it had been in his experience. Of course, that's an incredibly positive desire. I just felt very sorry that I hadn't listened better to him at the start to understand what he was saying, because that made me understand and listen and get alongside him a lot better. It makes me think, how well do I know the stories of everyone here at All Saints? How well do we know each other's stories? Because often we just come and we do listen to each other, but there's a whole load of our stories probably, some things we don't share, but there's probably a lot that we could share that we haven't, that may influence how we see one another and how we better relate. So the call to listen beyond ignorance is recognising that we all make assumptions and just taking the extra time to say, so what is really going on? How well do we know each other's stories? Obviously, where there are different cultures and backgrounds involved, that might make it more difficult, as it is with when we get to issues of sexuality. I'm talking with a few of you over the last few months, then some of us, it's simply not knowing the terminology. Many of us grew up without any teaching at all. It was kept quiet. And hence the level of ignorance many of us grew up with is quite high. So when we hear about LGBTI+, or LGBTIAQ+, and all the letters, many of us will stop and think, what do the letters mean? Of course, it's easy to find out these days online. You can do a search, what does it mean? But that's just a simple thing. Actually, if we've got people who will identify in those ways, and we're just ignorant of the basics of what that might mean or what it's about, then we'll find it hard to listen and understand and appreciate. And maybe something we can do is at least address the basics of ignorance. It doesn't then mean everyone sees, what is gay or queer in the same way, because each is individual. But it will at least mean that we have something to go on. Addressing ignorance can be something straightforward that we can do. To be a welcoming church, as all churches say they're welcoming. I haven't yet been to one church that says, we really don't want to be a welcoming church. We really want to put people off. I used to visit churches every Sunday, different churches as a living. And some were obviously more welcoming than others, but everyone sees themselves as welcoming. But actually, it's not so much it's partly do we offer a welcome, but it's also do others hear it as a welcome. And some of the way people feel they're welcomed is that they can just be themselves and tell their story with a level of understanding being expressed, rather than shock or fear or a blank face. And so sometimes we do have to work at it, and I think that's why the diocese has set up a LGBTI+ chaplaincy service, just as a way of acknowledging that we struggle as local churches, and it's important to offer something across the diocese to make sure there's opportunity for people to feel welcomed and understood. And people from all sorts of perspectives serve on that chaplaincy. So it's not promoting a particular thing, it's saying, let's just make sure we're listening. And all of this today is not about, promoting a particular agenda, but it is about making sure we get involved with people. And if you think of Jesus meeting people, I was just thinking in John's Gospel, he started out with a Jewish leader, Nicodemus, then he met that Samaritan woman by the well, then a Gentile, we think it's a Gentile army officer, chapter 5. He goes on to meet others, and each one is very different. And of course the conversation Jesus had with them was different. He was listening, he was responding to where they were. Jesus in that is alongside. And the reading that Sandra read for us from the book of Philippians encourages us to have the same attitude or mind of Christ. It's actually not just the word is mind in the translation we have, but it kind of means the whole perspective to be one and action to be like Jesus. To listen, to be with others in the way Jesus did. So when we listen to the Gospels of Jesus speaking to people, particularly those on the edge, those like the Samaritan woman or the army officer that others wouldn't have listened to, we are to be people who are ready and particularly look out to hear others who are different to us. And in Philippians it gives that, has to be one of the most used passages in theology of the last 50 years. I could expound in many different ways how this has been used, but it seems particularly popular in the last 50 years because it is about Jesus emptying himself. This is why it's called kenotic theology, if you're into the theology bit of it. But it's about somehow Jesus saying, I'm not going to start from that place of privilege, of being equal with God, but rather I'm going to come with God alongside us in an everyday kind of way. He made himself nothing. He took the nature of a servant, made in human likeness, humbling himself, of course, even to death. There's something here of an image of Christ as the God who comes alongside, who doesn't start by saying, well, I've got it sorted, which if anyone could, Jesus could. It's kind of like, it comes alongside and says, what's going on here? Where's the person at? What's it like? And listened and was there. It's almost like, of course, the tension in this passage is how does God empty God's self? Well, that's a kind of a complex theology, but there's something about God who's full of love, but pours out love to us without losing love in God's self. There's something of an outpouring of love. When we pour out love, eventually we collapse if we keep doing it without receiving. But there's something in God which is an infinite ability to pour out love without losing that infinite amount of love that is in God. And so here there's something of Jesus pictured as the one who pours out that love, being alongside others, without losing the love that's infinite. Who might we meet this week? Who might we be alongside that we're called simply to listen to hear? Where can we address our ignorance? There are things we can all do that are very simple and everyday to make sure we pause a bit more with the people that we meet, and like my example, remember to ask them questions before just sort of speaking out my own wisdom and supposed knowledge first. Something very practical we can do so that we can listen beyond our ignorance. And perhaps more briefly, the second one, we're to pay attention to power. If you notice that in Philippians, of course, Jesus humbles himself and then is lifted up to the right hand of God. It's not denying that there is Jesus comes with divine power and authority. There's something here in which cannot be denied, that Jesus is divine. But power can be exerted well or badly. Power is a reality. How we exert it may be different. You might want to say a bit about the way power is exercised politically in our nation, or for the Ukraine and Russia, and there's a lot there that could be said. But maybe we're just in this way also thinking more locally and individually. What sort of power? Maybe we just simply need to ask that question. What power do we have? Maybe we have particular roles that come with power, whether it's formal or informal power. I've been often very aware as vicar that I follow a whole stream of vicars, and we've got them all named on the sheet that go back to 1200s or whenever, and it feels like you're kind of stepping into a whole line of people who've been here with roles over the years. And of course, talking with different people in the community, some of us as vicars, well, probably all of us as vicars, get something right and something wrong. And therefore, there are times when we are granted power and authority and we make good use of it, and there's times when we don't manage to. And sometimes that legacy, I know, can last quite a while, as I pick up people for whom their image of vicar, whether it's here or often elsewhere, has difficult stories. And that's just the reality. We all fall short. But that we all might carry authority in our families and with our friends. People will look to us for our wisdom. We carry that kind of power whether we have a role or not. The question is, are we going to use power rightly? And that's why the traditional reading for this Sunday in Lent is Luke 4 and the temptations of Jesus. where he just challenges three things: the power and our desire. Do we long for good things? Is our power come out of our longing for good for others? Jesus was, of course, tempted for a longing for food. Very simple every day. But he's pointing out the issue of, do we long to use our power for good or just to do the things we think are the best? And of course, do we use our power to silence others? Which is what happens if we talk too much, or if we just assume that our view is the majority one. There's something about needing to have our power searched, if you like, our desires searched. What do we really desire? That's a kind of an inward thing, isn't it? Of course, we'll say, oh, I desire good things, but it's a little more complex than that. And the temptation is just saying that we need to be searched as to whether we use power for the good desires of all, not just our own, which we may not have reviewed and examined. That's why Jesus says, you do not live on bread alone, and the other versions in the other Gospel says, but on every word that comes from the mouth of God. There's something about listening to the Scriptures which challenges us, and we need that. Power and desire. Secondly, power and control. Jesus looking over all the kingdoms and saying, all these you can rule over. It's an image of control, where we want power so we can control life. And some of us, maybe all of us in different ways, feel easier if we are in control. There's something deep down, isn't there? I'd rather be in control of my life. And there's a good thing in that, but there's also a bad thing. Because if in wanting to control life, we're controlling others and forcing them into patterns that are not them, then something's gone wrong. That's why Jesus, who does have authority over all, directs himself and us to worship God. Because that's the position of humility that says, I'm not in control of it all. God is, and I may just glimpse part of what God is up to. There's a humility which worship is a vital part. If we don't have worship and knowledge of God, then it can be harder to challenge the notion of power and control. Although equally, of course, religions can be places where control is grasped at. So it's also, a lot of these passages are addressed as critical of those of us in religious roles. Finally, power and display. Jesus taking up to the temple. How about throwing yourself off, doing something dramatic? Achieve something visible. I kind of think it might be one of those. Anyone does those business things where you're supposed to, give your grand vision for the next 5 years. I think a few of us have gone through that. And of course, it's right that we explore together, where we're going, and that's important. But sometimes, if we're not careful, it becomes this will be the great thing that will make my name. Or this will be the thing that makes the company or the church look really good. I'm going to have this great display. I'm going to use power so that it looks good. So Jesus was tempted to throw himself off the temple and be caught. But, of course, directed himself and us to humbly trust God and not put God to the test. Power is not about just some big display or some project that will make it all feel good and better. Often power is worked much more one-to-one with individuals and working together gradually towards something of God's kingdom. We pay attention to power, which is a searching of who we are inside. That's why we need a whole season of Lent rather than just one sermon or 5 minutes to think, how am I doing? But we can search ourselves. What are we desiring? Where are we wanting to control things and others in ways that are not so healthy? Where are we just wanting something that says, yeah, this is the big thing, or this is the thing that will make meaning for me? And until we address that, then we leave all sorts of issues of power unaddressed, and that is where things go wrong. It's where in church life there have been high-profile cases of abuse and things which are so tragic and awful because we haven't searched, we haven't put into practice what we say every Lent, which is, we are sinners before the Christ who died for us and lifts us up. It's so important that we address these things just in an everyday situation because they help us live out better lives. So this morning, as we're in the start of Lent, we're to listen better to one another beyond our ignorance. We're to pay attention to power. And above all, it's so that we can live well together. Living well together is what Jesus came to bring us, to inspire us. And above all, I'm just struck by the need for humility. Just saying, well, here I am, whatever role and the new role I will have. It's just having to come and say, Lord, I'm just me in the end, and you're rather bigger than me. We pause, we kneel in prayer, and we say, Lord, help me to listen, help me to be aware of the power that I exert. Search my heart. In the end, we carry little but the love of Christ, and that is sufficient. Maybe for me, for you, we can say, help me to carry the love of Christ above all, that I can listen better, address my ignorance, and better wield the power that I have in the lives of others. May Jesus help us this day and this season. Amen.